Today's topic on education is Georgetown County's education legacy of the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Lee Brockington.
Thank you. And I noticed too that just about the time that Bob remained standing and became president, that all his officers are seated here on the front row. All of your fellow officers are right here, aren't they? It's a great room. I hope you can see me. And if not, you brought binoculars. I know. I'm not terribly tall, but I am terribly loud. So let me know in the back if there's a time where you can't hear me, and we'll give up on if you can't see me. The governor in the back says he can hear me, and so can everyone else in the children's department. Genevieve Chandler was the teacher in 1909 at Collins Creek. 8 grades in a one-room schoolhouse, and she was the only teacher. She rode horseback from Murrells Inlet and fought the elements to arrive, the elements like copperheads and rattlesnakes who were shot on sight. Students were taller than she was, and when she realized that the students' parents couldn't read or write, at this rural white school, she'd return at night with her mother and a pot of coffee and donuts in the buggy to teach adults by lantern. She also taught blacks in her kitchen on the marsh at Murrells Inlet. Years later, when Genevieve Chandler's daughter, Genevieve's sister, Peterkin, was working the polls, 60 years later, many of the former students, many of those the children said, "I don't have to just make a mark. I can sign my name because your mama taught me how." Education has always been the great equalizer for people in a society. Its goal to create equal opportunities for every member of the community. Much of the 300-year-old history of South Carolina's public school system is a tragic tale of its starts and fits and starts, marked at times by inspired leadership, but too often marred by problems of class and race, war, poverty, and geography. Under a new South Carolina state constitution in 1895, power in our state trickled down from state government to the people. It did not flow upward as it should have in a democracy. This new constitution in 1895 was approved at the state convention but not ratified by the people. Instead, it laid the groundwork for what we now call the Jim Crow era, the world that developed in South Carolina, according to Dr. Walter Edgar in his South Carolina, A History. That Constitution laid the groundwork for the Jim Crow era in our state. Separate schools were mandated for black and for white, and under Governor Benjamin Tillman, the openly racist governor of South Carolina, no attempts were made to comply with the U.S. Supreme Court mandate of separate but equal, laid out in Plessy versus Ferguson. Black schools, rural and urban in South Carolina, suffered even greater hardships than white schools. Education of the masses was very low on South Carolina's list of priorities. And at the turn of the 20th century, as South Carolina stumbled into a new era, there was no true system of public education. The state superintendent in the year 1900 reported to the General Assembly, to our senators, to our House of Representatives. It's a misnomer to say we have a system of public education. There is no system, no orderly organization. Each district has as poor schools as its people will tolerate. And in some districts, anything will be tolerated. Remember that, as poor as will be tolerated. In the year 1900, Georgetown County was much like the rest of the state, in the hands of the white population. After the brief flirtation of Reconstruction, of black education, of black office holding, black-owned businesses, many whites openly responded to what is sometimes called the Negro question. In the Georgetown County population, it was 90% black, still as late as 1900. And leading citizens, white citizens like Dr. James R. Sparkman, wrote that he was quite convinced that the civilizing tendencies of slavery had been stripped away. Dr. Sparkman wrote that the civilizing tendencies of slavery had been stripped away and that the Negro was reverting to his natural barbarous state. A new imperialism nurtured this paternal way of thinking, and a return to whites sharing common burdens rather than improving the lot of the poor, black and white, emerged. At the turn of the 20th century, the theory that to educate a Negro is to spoil a laborer. That was the thought that prevailed among the white leaders of what was then called the Solid South, the New Democrats. The Plantation Myth was also born at this time. Responding to mass United States immigration via New York, many Americans sought their roots, their American roots. About 1900, memory groups were formed. Think of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and also the first Confederate Memorial Day was celebrated on May 10th, 1896. Ironically, Northerners purchasing duck hunting plantations in Georgetown County would further nurture the myth. Instead of millionaires moving from the north and bringing progress to Georgetown County, instead it perpetuated the plantation lifestyle, the plantation myth. They adopted all the ways of the former landed gentry. They extended the plantation legacy. They needed an inexpensive labor force, and many of their employees, just like at Hobcaw Barony, continued to live in former slave villages until the 1950s. Bernard Baruch was the first Northerner to purchase a plantation in Georgetown County for his family's use. 16,000 acres of former rice plantations. He rejoined those plantations and reverted to the original name, originally named Hobcaw Barony, in 1718. And at Hobcaw, we're coming up on an anniversary, 300 years, and we'll be offering programs next semester that especially focus on much of our early colonial history and results of recent archaeology, Native American, early colonial, African American. Bernard Baruch, his wife and 3 daughters, purchased the plantation in 1905, again 16,000 acres, and used the plantation from Thanksgiving to Easter, establishing also 2 plantation schools at Hobcaw Barony, one for the children of white employees and one for the children of black employees, black teacher and a white teacher, and Bernard Baruch paid both those teachers' salaries. Bernard Baruch had about 100 employees altogether. The white school was built not far from Belfield Plantation, and also for black children on Strawberry Hill Plantation, so known to many people as Strawberry Schoolhouse. With over 100 employees, Bernard Baruch had a need to provide employee housing, transportation, and education, certainly to help maintain a stable labor force. Paternalistic, to be sure, meeting the needs of his laborers, not unlike a textile mill village, meets every need of the employee. Housing, job, church, recreation center at a textile mill, or even a city today that realizes parks are important for families. Good schools are important to keep those people in the county working at those jobs that enhance the tax base, and then in order with those taxes to provide better parks, better schools. It's a vicious cycle in many ways, but we're doing it today to maintain the health of our cities, just as Bernard Baruch as a paternal leader, paternalistically was doing it at Hobcaw. In 1910, a white school with a white teacher, paid for again by the Baruchs, educated children of the Vareens, the Marlows, the Masseys, and the Buxtons. Educated them in the white school until 1935, when a bridge was built to the mainland. What year? 1935. And I mentioned last week and to all of my students, no matter where you're from, a bridge changes the economy, a bridge changes the culture. So for Georgetown County, the date of 1935 is important. Remember too that in 1935 a school bus could get back and forth from the Waccamaw Neck, across across the Sandpit River, across at Johanna Bridge, especially buses that only carried white students into town for education, carried them up and brought them to Georgetown to improved schools that we'll mention in just a moment. At Strawberry School, as many as 50 children in its heyday sat in the one-room schoolhouse. Former student Minnie Kennedy described her experiences there. Our teachers often were only 16 or 17 years old themselves. Barely could they read themselves, and the books we used were hand-me-downs, the ones thrown out by the white schools. But somehow, Minnie said, I learned to read, and I was known as the reader. The adults brought their mail to me to read. My father and mother were very proud of me for being able to read. My brothers and sisters, not too much. Not so much. Mose Jenkins, another resident of 20th century resident of Hobcaw Barony, remembered the one-room schoolhouse at Strawberry and told me that he loved to go into school early. And he would often bring in the firewood off the front porch and stack it up by the wood stove inside the school. And a man always came by and lit the fire for the school teacher. He would stay after school and he would clean the small blackboard that was there. He would burn any trash that had accumulated. He would clean out the ash from the wood stove. And he said often he was the last to leave. And I said, Mose, you must have had a crush on your teacher. And he told me about Mrs. Ethel Bezelou. Bezelou, a last name known in this county for two things, religion and education, always an active family for a generation since emancipation. Miss Ethel Bezelou, he said, was tall and beautiful. And I said, so you stayed late and helped her because you had a crush on her? And he said, well, you see, Miss Bezelou, she had a car, a caramel-colored Buick. And if I stayed long enough, she'd give me a ride back to Friendfield Village. Think about riding on the running board in a caramel-colored Buick. But others did say they had a crush on Miss Bezelou, but not because she was tall, not because she was beautiful, but because she was an encourager. Robert McClary, a student at Strawberry School from 1939 until about 1943, when he did have the opportunity to come into town, he remembered Mrs. Bezelou very fondly. When Reverend George Washington Bezelou, her brother-in-law, a black man, George Washington Bezelou, bought a bus and began to pick up students and transport them in town to Howard High School for blacks in the 1940s, Mrs. Bezelou said, Robert, stay in school. When he left Hobcaw Barony in 1949, still without a high school diploma at age 19, to head up to Detroit, where other family members lived, promised him a place to stay and a job, he heard Mrs. Bezelou's words as he packed his small little bag and left for Detroit. Robert, I want you to stay in school. He did. He went to school at night and worked during the day as a 19, 20, 21-year-old. He got his high school diploma, and then he worked more. He became the first black firefighter in Detroit. He became the first black fire inspector in Detroit. He went on to get his college degree at Wayne State University. Later, he got his master's at Wayne State University, all the while with that one-room school teacher's words in his head, stay in school, Robert, stay in school. And when he died, not quite 2 years ago, he was living in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Remember that when you come visit the 1840 cabin where he grew up at Hobcaw. Shortly after the 1906 purchase of Arcadia Plantation, Isaac Emerson of Baltimore, who invented Bromo Seltzer. Captain Emerson, a chemist, developed Bromo Seltzer, made millions. He built the Emerson Hotel in Baltimore. Also, he bought 7 plantations, roughly, pieced them together, and named them for the first time Arcadia, just north of Hobcaw. But he rebuilt St. Anne's Church at Arcadia, rebuilt the church that is standing there today, and created a school for his black employees' children. One teacher was Miss Betty Bezelou, a relative of Ethel Bezelou. Single, young, Miss Betty Bezelou was a teacher there when Emerson's grandson, George Vanderbilt, took over Arcadia. But it was the plantation superintendent, Neil Cox, who made sure that she always had what she needed to teach. Betty Bezelou married Bill Murray. Many of y'all know Bill Murray, who was born on Sandy Island, never been to the mainland until he was 8 years old. And I learned recently when we attended their 75th wedding anniversary, 70th wedding anniversary. It was their friend, Miss Brockington, a black woman, who gave them the money for the marriage license, $5 or $10. So I always loved to tease the Murrays and say, had it not been for a Brockington, none of this would have happened, none of this. But think also about Miss Betty Bezelou marrying Bill Murray, and we'll speak of their influence at Parkersville at Pawleys Island shortly. Another plantation owner from the north provided schools for their black employees in other parts of Georgetown County's rural areas. But what about the schools at Brook Green? What about the school at Brook Green before the Huntingtons ever purchased Brook Green? And then what did the Huntingtons accomplish when they did come? At Brook Green, New Yorkers who owned the property before the Huntingtons established a school as early as 1885. We mentioned it last week. The Waccamaw mission saw not just to education and academic needs, but also to health and to religious needs among local blacks. It was located on River Road that came right up to the old gates within what you think of as Brook Green Gardens today. The Waccamaw mission included an industrial school for women and girls. In 1901, the Episcopal Church took over the Waccamaw mission at Brook Green and renamed it Holy Cross Brook Green. In 1931, with new ownership of Brook Green by Archer and Anna Hyatt Huntington, Brook Green was to become a public garden. So Archer bought what you and I might consider an out parcel bought from the Episcopal Church, what you and I would consider an out parcel. This was an interesting and generous transaction. The Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina had taken over the Waccamaw mission, renamed it Holy Cross, but a few miles away it was also operating Faith Memorial, a very similar church, school, and mission to the blacks of the Pawleys Island population. The two merged in 1931 to become Holy Cross Faith Memorial, and Archer actually knew the land was worth $500, but instead he paid $6,000 for that small parcel of land, enabling Holy Cross Faith Memorial to build a building, to build a church building, to build a campus, and a parish house, we might call it, which for many years would simply be known as Miss Ruby's School. Holy Cross Brook Green, when still at Brook Green, had about 50 children and was closely linked to the work of the church. The school was the outreach of the church in fulfilling a need in the community, and daily prayers and devotions were part of that school routine. Archer and Anna Hyatt Huntington built two schools in the area. Constructed by Mr. James E. McQuaid. One was built in 1932 on what we call Wesley Road at Brook Green's northern boundary. Think of the recycling center in Murrells Inlet. Does that help? Wesley Road, the north boundary. It was a large school, about 50 students there as well. 8 tall windows on the east side and the west side, filling the school with light. This school was in operation until the 1960s, and the ruins of the cafeteria portion can still be seen through the trees, and the church beside it, built, still stands, and as far as I know, is still in use. In 1932, also, the Huntingtons built a school on Sandy Island that remained in operation until 1966. Laura Harriet, whom many of you have met and visited on Sandy Island, was a student at that school, and there its 2 rooms served a large population at one time. The Sandy Island School still belongs to Brook Green Gardens. Bids are being accepted currently for its restoration, and the interior has been used as a community center and a library, currently filled with a large number of computers. A community center is often a school or a library, a place of learning. It was certainly the case in all the years that a school operated on the grounds of the then all-black Holy Cross Faith Memorial Church, Holy Cross Faith Memorial Episcopal Church at Pawleys Island, located on Highway 17. I hate to use this, but you know, all my landmarks are food. The church is located just north of Litchfield Restaurant. You know, not too long ago we were given directions, and I know there's a problem between the north and the south. A lot of times Southerners were made fun of for saying you go up there where Mr. Henry's red truck is parked at the corner and his big hound dog will be lying out in the sun. And the Yankee said, well, what if Henry's gone off in his red pickup truck and his hound dog's gone with him? And the Southerner put his hands on his hips and says, well, sir, you turn anyway. The other day, somebody was telling me how to get to something on Highway 17, and I just wasn't really familiar with it. And they said, well, you know where Dr. Smith's office is? I said, no, ma'am. Well, you go up until you get to Dr. Jones' office. You know where that is? And I said, no, ma'am. And they said, well, how about Dr. Reynolds? Dr. McAllister? And I thought, boy, that's crazy. All of her directions are based on the doctors that she has to go to. That sure does tell you something about her age. A day or two later, somebody asked me directions to something in Litchfield. And I said, well, leave out a hobcall. You'll get to Hog Heaven. Keep on going. Then you'll get to Hardee's. Keep on going. You'll see McDonald's on the left. And I thought to myself, boy, that's sure telling them something about my size. Directions. So, Holy Cross Faith Memorial on the west side of Highway 17, just north of Litchfield Restaurant. Holy Cross Faith Memorial was being served in 1927 by the Reverend William Forsyth, and there were 3 teachers in elementary and in high school by the 1930s, a black private parochial school. In 1932, a freestanding parish school was completed on the grounds, and Reverend Forsyth's wife, Ruby, began to teach in the lower elementary. Ruby Middleton Forsyth was from Charleston, and she was well educated. First at a private school in the city where she grew up. So often private schools formed because there was no adequate free school for blacks. After 6th grade in Charleston, she attended the Avery Normal School in downtown Charleston on Bull Street, not far from the College of Charleston campus. Avery Normal School became Avery Institute. Today it's known as the College of Charleston's Avery Research Center for African American History. First time I ever went to the Avery Center, several years ago, I walked in and I was very quiet and I wanted to do some research, but I was just sort of looking and trying to act like it wasn't my first time. And the curator there said, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm from Pawleys Island, South Carolina. And she said, oh, you've got one of our graduates at Pawleys Island, and pointed to Miss Ruby Middleton Forsyth's photograph on the wall at Avery, proud as they were of their graduate. She attended there, and she was an excellent student. Avery was already well known in the 1920s when Ruby attended there. It was an excellent teacher training school. So many South Carolina teachers in the 20th century, remember, had little or no training, white or black. Some did not even have a high school degree, and were teaching in the 1920s. Think also about Ruby learning quickly at Avery and in Charleston about racial disparity, of separate and unequal, but also she had the opportunity to see the first black faculty hired at Avery, replacing white teachers. She also saw the first black principal at Avery, replacing a white principal at this black school. But Miss Ruby also learned that segregated schools could prevent her race from being overlooked in the system. A very famous black educator felt the same way. Booker T. Washington and many others argued this point, as have single-gender colleges and organizations and even the Boy Scouts in recent years. Is there value in single race, single gender? And some would say yes. She got her first job after graduating from Avery in rural Mount Pleasant. You've moved here since Hurricane Hugo. It's hard to believe that rural Mount Pleasant. You know, I'm still wondering about y'all from New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania watching the national news after Hurricane Hugo, seeing all the damage. No electricity for weeks, no ice, no air conditioning, no dehumidifiers, snakes, alligators. You turn to your spouse and say, hey, that looks like a good place to move to. Nikki Best is trying to encourage her parents right now to move to the beach, and I'm thinking this year's hurricane season might not encourage them enough. Think about rural Mount Pleasant in the late 20s. Rural because there was no bridge to Charleston until 1929 in Charleston. 1929 in Charleston. She met Reverend Forsyth in Charleston, in Mount Pleasant actually, and they married in 1926. I remember the way she dipped her chin one time when she said, I never thought I'd marry a churchman. Ooh, in 1938, she joined her husband at Holy Cross Faith Memorial, where he was now rector and teacher. She was very surprised by how rural Pawleys Island was. If she thought Mount Pleasant was rural, imagine how rural Pawleys Island was, even though by 1938, there was a bridge to the mainland. There was one paved road going back and forth called Highway 17, but that's pretty much it, unless you count Shell Road as a paved road, crushed shell. She was very surprised. She also found few stores, no street lights. She said, I was a city girl. I grew up in Charleston and I was used to city ways. The first week I moved here, I cried the whole week. I heard her tell that story a few years later, and she said, when I first moved here, I cried the whole month. And before she died in 1992, she told that story to a camera, national television, and she said, when I first moved here, I cried the whole first year. I was a city girl, and it was so rural here. But her work at the school encompassed 53 years. And the only time she was absent was when her one child was born. And some of you that came to the induction of Miss Ruby Forsyth into the Georgetown County Women's Hall of Fame remember being there and remember meeting that one son who spoke at the ceremonies. Every year in March, we induct one woman deceased into the Georgetown County Women's Hall of Fame. Miss Ruby's motto is well known. Never say I can't. Say I'll try. Y'all have heard that from various sources, and people that knew Miss Ruby knew that that was something she often said. And I was glad I remembered that one time because in an oft-told story, if y'all have heard this story before, just take a little nap. I'll wake you up. But I do think there's merit to this story. When I first came to work at Hobcaw in 1984, we developed outreach programs to schools. And in 1985 or so, I had a program called Creepycrawlers, where I took skins and skulls, I took live turtles that would crawl, and I also had something special in a pillowcase that I pulled out at the very end. And I'll tell you what that is if you hadn't guessed. A live snake. So I get to the school, everything's going great with the skins and the skulls. The students in that one-room schoolhouse at Miss Ruby's at Holy Cross Faith Memorial are in a big circle, and I'm in the middle, and I've been able to talk and show. They've been touching, those students have. They've been feeling things. They've been nodding their heads and answering questions, and the turtle was a hit. And every time they'd reach out for the turtle, that turtle would pull into that shell. And we talked about protection and the predator-prey relationship, and Miss Ruby the whole time was right there just asking them questions, nodding her head, laughing, looking. And then I told them I got one more thing. And I opened up the pillowcase and I turned. No one was in the room. And I looked again and all the children were back up against the wall, as far away from me as I am from you in the way back. And then I found Miss Ruby in the back, like this. And I went over to her because I realized not a single child was coming forward to touch my snake. Not a single child was willing to touch it. They were afraid of snakes, and naturally so. Some snakes, well, all snakes can bite, so can your cat, so can your dog. Some snakes are venomous, and it's good advice to simply leave snakes alone. But I also wanted them to have an understanding of snakes. I wanted them to know that one snake could consume so many rats and so many mice, that there was worth in every living thing, and that snakes didn't have to be scary, but by identifying the 5 venomous snakes, they're home free when they see a different snake. And I went over to Miss Ruby and I said, Miss Ruby, I'm going to need you to touch this snake. And she said, I can't. So what did I say? Never say I can't. Say I'll try. And Miss Ruby dropped her arms. She said, I'll try, to the students. And she brought up that one finger and she touched that snake, and then she said, oh, it's not slimy. And one by one, those children edged up from being seated on the floor against the wall back to the circle, and everyone just about reached out their finger and eventually their hand and felt that snake. Some of them held the other end of the snake. And it was a great victory for education. It's a great victory for Miss Ruby that day, whose own motto was, never say I can't, say I'll try. Her students were encouraged always to be deep thinkers, to have high morals, and to have nice manners. Public school teachers who received her older students as they graduated from her elementary program and were mainstream, so to speak, into public school, said you could always tell one of Miss Ruby's students. She was, they had such good manners, high morals, looked you in the eye when they conversed with you. Miss Ruby was also known to teach with a warm heart and a firm hand. And you can guess what I mean by that. Her paddle is on exhibit at the Rice Museum on Front Street. If you go upstairs, you'll see her paddle, and you'll see photographs and learn more about her. But she taught with a warm heart and a firm hand. Her one-room schoolhouse was private, church-affiliated, though there was a lack of financial support from the church. But no child was ever turned away because they could not pay tuition. She typically had 65 students at a time, and she was about 4'10" and 3/4, about 4'10". Because of her belief in education, she was recognized as one of Newsweek magazine's America's Unsung Heroes. She appeared in Family Circle magazine, but she also appeared on 60 Minutes. And then she was named by President George H.W. Bush as one of America's 1,000 points of light, recognizing people across the United States. When she died in 1992, the school remained open for a short period of time, then became a child care center, and eventually closed as good schools and good child care centers became available in the area. 600 people attended Miss Ruby's funeral, so many of them 3 generations of former students. And so if Miss Ruby and a few wealthy Northerners and a few others, of course, that we just don't have time to talk about today, were providing private school education, what was being provided by the government to the so-called Negro population at that time? The South Carolina State Superintendent in 1911 reported the Negro schoolhouses are miserable beyond description. Our own school superintendent. The supplies the state provided, I thought this was interesting when I looked it up. The state was willing to provide to Negro schoolhouses an axe, firewood, a water bucket and dipper, a table and chair for the teacher, and crude benches for the students, and an oil lamp. In Georgetown and in Andrews, large brick schools were built for the white population. In Georgetown, you may remember that last week we discussed Winyah Indigo School had created Winyah Indigo Society had created a school for poor children with scholarships for about 12 pupils, and that Winyah Indigo School was still operational by 1908, when a new brick building was created on Cleland Street, just behind us, a new brick building still standing for the city's white children. A city school board oversaw the Winyah School operation, an outgrowth of Winyah Indigo School, and soon beside it, a new Winyah High School was built and Winyah Auditorium in 1924. Although Winyah High burned, and we'll talk some more about that, burned in 1981, the auditorium remains and, ironically, still used for education. After years of being empty, the auditorium's classrooms are now utilized by a public school charter school, the Georgetown School for the Arts and Sciences, begun about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. So Winyah School and a few rural church-supported schools and the woefully inadequate colored schools, despite all of that, the Negro problem persisted. The Negro problem, as it was called and discussed. So much so, nationally, that Booker T. Washington, the president of the Tuskegee Normal and Agricultural Institute, was seeking economic advancement through education, but without challenging racial segregation. Washington's goal was to provide safe, purpose-built schools for African Americans. Schools built to be schools, not hand-me-down buildings, not in a meeting place, not in a church, not in a lodge. Purpose-built schools for African Americans in the rural South. Booker T. Washington approached a Jewish man named Julius Rosenwald, who just happened to be president of the then Sears and Roebuck Company in 1912. And Julius Rosenwald was fascinated with Booker T. Washington's philosophy of self-help. In 1912, Rosenwald gave a $25,000 gift for matching grants to build schools under the auspices of the Tuskegee Institute. 6 more schools were built in addition with money left over from the grants. 100 more schools were built in 1914. 200 more schools were built in 1916, Julius Rosenwald's matching funds. By 1917, Julius Rosenwald created his own Julius Rosenwald Fund and eventually was responsible for building 5,000 African American schools in the South between 1917 and 1932. But I want you to remember something before you think he built all these schools with his money. Keywords: matching funds. As I read and researched about Rosenwald Schools about 20 years ago, I discovered a woman named Mary Canty of Myrtle Beach, an African-American woman whose Rosenwald designed school in Myrtle Beach is where she once attended. Well, I really didn't want to say it out loud, but like a lot of people, I said, "Oh, you grew up in Myrtle Beach?" And I almost said, "I didn't know there were any black people in Myrtle Beach." And she said, after I came up with a way to ask her that, she said, "Oh, we were here, you just didn't see us on the beach. It was illegal for us to be on the beach. We could be arrested unless we were minding children. You could see us in the restaurants, you could see us in the homes, you could see us in the businesses, cleaning and working. And we did live in what you call the city of Myrtle Beach, and we did have a colored school. But it was one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure that the colored school, a Rosenwald designed building, was not demolished as it was set to be. And today the Colored School Museum stands in Myrtle Beach and is open by appointment, and all that means is you call the city of Myrtle Beach and tell them when you want to come, and they'll make it available. It also serves as a community center where tutoring is occurring and computer classes and other ventures on one half while the museum is on one side. Mary Canty also helped me understand some of the differences between Rosenwald built schools and Rosenwald designed schools, and I decided it's not that different from the Robert Mills courthouses all over South Carolina, inspired by the design or built and designed personally by Robert Mills. Rosenwald The Rosenwald story and her own story, again, yes, there were blacks in Myrtle Beach. I think often about blacks being able to use Atlantic Beach, an African resort where they owned property, African American resort beach. Also closer to Pawleys Island, Magnolia Beach Club, known later after Hurricane Hazel in the 50s as Mackenzie Beach. And I think you may have read articles about Magnolia or Mackenzie Beach, and hopefully you'll see the new documentary that was featured in the Post-Courier not too long ago on Charlie's Place, an important part of our local history. Charlie's Place, although located in Myrtle Beach, catered to the same crowd that visited the clubs and the overnight accommodations at Magnolia Beach Club, and some of the guests included people like Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Lena Horne, later Little Richard, James Brown, and Ray Charles. Think about so many in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, so many of these black musicians performing at the Ocean Forest Hotel, but of course they couldn't stay at the hotel. So they often played and stayed at Charlie's Place or at Magnolia Beach Club between Litchfield and Pawleys. Also, it was there at Charlie's Place where he operated a dance club, and as you'll learn in the documentary, whites and blacks danced together in the 1950s. And it was so outrageous that the Ku Klux Klan did a raid on Charlie's Place. Remember the documentary? You already know the director and producer, Betsy Newman, who also did the Baruchs of Hobcall, the documentary that airs regularly on South Carolina ETV. Other Rosenwald schools are listed with South Carolina Department of Archives and History, and I decided once as I prepared to give a lecture on Miss Ruby once, I wondered to myself if there were any Rosenwald schools in Georgetown County. Well, I found two online, one in Andrews, and I've talked to a black woman there, a black woman who taught at that school in Andrews, and also I found one at Pawleys. I was intrigued, and I called and talked to staff person there, Brad Sauls, and we had a long talk, and I said, well, exactly where was it? And he said, well, I'm not sure, but I think it's still Pawleys Island, but it says Parkersville. And I said, absolutely, I know exactly where that is. And I'll help you understand where it is in just a moment. Parkersville at Pawleys, where education continues to this day with the Pawleys Island Child Development Center, with St. John's AME Church, been there since 1867 and just celebrated an anniversary, as well as Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. They cradle the site where the Rosenwald School once stood. It burned. It was rebuilt, and today that building is painted purple and used as the Pawleys Island Child Development Center. In 1954, just before integration, Parkersville Elementary School, a brick building, was built beside it. That whole campus, so to speak, still involved in education, was the site of the Rosenwald School, built in 1921. But listen to this. Remember I said that about matching funds? 1920, construction began with $4,185 in hand. Rosenwald donated $1,000, but also others were expected to donate too. Not just one other party. Rosenwald expected the state, a public donation, that would be our state government, our education fund. He also expected the black population to contribute, and he also expected the white population to contribute. Today we'd call this partnership, wouldn't we? Rosenwald, the public, white, and black. Rosenwald donated how much? $1,000. The public, or state government, donated $600. The white population donated $35. The black population donated $2,550 in 1920, or by 1920. And before I talk about that sacrifice, remember, even $35 from the white population was above and beyond any Rosenwald school built in Williamsburg County. The white donation to those schools in Rosenwald, according to the figures with the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, 0. Over and over. 0. $35 from members of the white community reminds me of something Alberta Lashcott Quattlebaum said years ago. When somebody was talking about taxes and talking about the Waccamaw Neck, they said, wow, the Waccamaw Neck is carrying the whole rest of the county. And she said, well, it's about time. For 100 years, they've been carrying us. The Waccamaw Neck was wasted real estate. Acres and acres of salt marsh, which y'all know was worthless until research in the 1970s. No trees, and you can't farm it. Salt marsh. The rice fields that make up so much of the acreage on the Waccamaw Neck, wasted real estate, non-agricultural, not good for anything but some migratory waterfowl. Think about timber harvesting. Some truck farming, some harvesting, and commercial harvesting of oysters and shrimp. But think about the extreme poverty on the Waccamaw Neck. Even for 35 whites to donate to a black school says something. But for that black population to donate by 1920 $2,550 tells us something of the mood of the individuals, and it tells us something of the church leadership and individuals that were determined that their children would have an education. In that repressed 1920 economy, in the isolation of Georgetown County, physical and social isolation, imagine the sacrifice of the Negro population for Parkersville School. I like to imagine those leaders and the church members who became what United Way would call the pace setters. Remember that term, the pace setters, donating money to the Rosenwald School Fund because they believed in education. They believed education was the answer to progress. Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, again 1871, St. John's AME, 1867, flanked that site where the Rosenwald School stood, burned, and was rebuilt. Brick School next door, just before South Carolina's Briggs versus Elliott joined Brown versus Topeka Board of Education to lead to desegregation. 1954 Supreme Court decision included a case in Summerton, South Carolina, Briggs versus Elliott. Some of you traveled with me to that school in Summerton, South Carolina, in Clarendon County, not far from Manning, as we discussed the black parents' desire to have one bus. The black population in that area had 33 school buses, and blacks in Summerton School District asked for one bus and maybe some gas and maybe 4 tires for that one bus, and were refused. A minister who led the crusade for equal access to education was run out of town and was only able to return for his funeral, again, not far from Manning. But South Carolina did desegregate slowly. The need to finalize the process lasted into the late 20th century, and there's still some final funding discussions going on today with the Supreme Court and Georgetown County. In 1981, the white Winyah High School burned before it was fully integrated with black Howard High School in Georgetown's West End. Winyah High School was burned by arsonists, and no arrests have ever been made. The crime has not been solved. But Georgetown High School was built and fully integrated when it was built. Howard High School does still exist. It is still a place of learning, primarily vocational learning, secondary learning. There are a number of classes in adult education, as well as a newly restored gymnasium and public programs at Howard High School in the West End. But think about this merging of schools. If I said earlier that a school is also a community center, think about our rural black choppy high school that was closed, as was the white Pleasant Hill High School, to create the one Carver's Bay school system, Carver's Bay Elementary and High School, Middle School. Next door, our Carver's Bay Library, which we're so proud of. As we've struggled, and we've struggled about losing single-race schools due to pride, due to history, and the fact that these have been true rural community centers. Some people, like Booker T. Washington, feared being overshadowed when the races integrated for education. Social pressures are nothing compared to the economic pressures, however. South Carolina is historically in the lower education levels. Y'all know the saying, thank God for Mississippi. Y'all are laughing, but it's not really a joke, is it? I know. And yet black and white leaders have emerged from our state to do great things. Last year I briefly mentioned Ron McNair, the NASA astronaut in the space shuttle. I mentioned Charles Bolden, who just happened to be the graduation speaker at the University of Pittsburgh, where my son attended. Charles Bolden, whose mother was our librarian in Columbia at Dreher High School, who's done many things besides be an astronaut. Ron McNair, what do you remember from last week? He grew up in what town? Lake City, where he was turned away from the public library because he was black. Our own Georgetown County Library turned away blacks until the 1960s, late 60s. Sister Peterkin writes about that in her book. She was the librarian. At every library board meeting, she said, can we begin to check out books to blacks? Can we begin to allow them to come into the library and read? And each time she was told no, she marked it down, but she also marked down how many people requested books. Read that chapter. Ron McNair, I mentioned last week, but also the nation's, and I will say, the best Secretary of Education, but I'd rather say considered by many to be one of the best Secretaries of Education. You know, my goal is to bring us all together, so I'd rather not be interpreted as talking politics today. But one of the best U.S. Secretaries of Education was Dick Riley, who ironically, one of the best U.S. Secretaries of Education hailed from South Carolina. Dick Riley. South Carolina Educational Television, however, produced one of the best documentaries on South Carolina's state education when it produced a documentary entitled The Corridor of Shame. The Corridor of Shame is the story of several counties which again ironically border on I-95. But it featured some of the poorest schools in the nation, literally third world conditions at the schools and at those students' home. So what can be done about education and its legacy? I think first by knowing our history. I think also by listening to others as they speak of their own personal experiences, and also by you reading more about blacks and whites who led the efforts for education reform, of people who fought the idea that to educate someone was to lose a good laborer. Each of you are interested in education. That's why you're here. That's why Friends of the Georgetown Library creates programming. Educating yourself by taking part in community programs. I challenge you to take some of these bits of information today about Georgetown County, about the Rosenwald School system, about Minnie Kennedy, about Myrtle Beach, and tell others about it. Look what you would be doing to further Georgetown County's education legacy. And what else can you do? You can donate, you can fundraise, you can volunteer, and then before long, we'll be talking about you as a part of Georgetown County's education legacy. Thank you. Thank you.